Feeling the heat of the war on Gaza. Israel says the fighting is costing it millions of dollars every day, and the devastation in the Strip is unprecedented. So what's the real cost to both sides? And what's the impact in the region and globally? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Tom McRae. A depleted workforce, the closure of schools and businesses, and now spiralling military expenses. Economists warn the cost to Israel of its war on Gaza will be unlike anything it has experienced in decades. Israel's declaration of war more than 3 weeks ago, following a surprise attack by Hamas, has jolted global financial and energy markets. Now, international financial institutions say the ongoing conflict will have bigger, more severe risks for the global economy. We'll be discussing those issues with our panel in just a few minutes. But first, this report by Cara Legg.
Day after day, Israel's devastating attacks keep coming. Under siege by air, sea and land, Gaza faces a humanitarian and economic catastrophe. But as Israel escalates its military offensive, the war on Gaza is also hitting its own economy. Since Hamas launched its operation more than 3 weeks ago, Israel's stocks and currency have fallen. Many of its businesses and schools remain closed, and international airlines have cancelled flights. Now its government has been forced to roll out a major wartime stimulus program that's expected to raise public debt. Already, 3 credit rating agencies have warned Israel's creditworthiness could be downgraded, with the S&P Global Ratings Agency changing its outlook from stable to negative. That hasn't fazed this man, Israel's finance minister, who says he doesn't yet have a full assessment of the cost of the war after announcing the national budget was no longer relevant. The cost of war is expected to increase. Israel's near $500 billion economy is one of the most developed in the Middle East. It's expected to contract by 5% in the final quarter of the year. Known as the nation for startups, its tech industry, that accounts for 18% of its GDP and half of all exports, is suffering. Production at a major offshore gas field that's reported to provide 70% of the country's energy needs has stopped. And its currency has lost value against the dollar almost every day for the past 3 weeks, hitting an 8-year low. With the cost of war at around $246 million per day, the indirect costs are expected to increase exponentially.
It's a very difficult situation. It's a war. Lots of people have been drafted in the army and left the job market. There's uncertainty. There are concerns that reduce people incentives to invest, both outside money coming to Israel and internally.
US President Joe Biden has pledged an unprecedented funding package for Israel, but the fate of that request rests in the hands of Congress. The World Bank has also warned that the global economy is at a dangerous juncture and facing what it called real risks. Cara Legg for Inside Story.
Let's bring in our guest now. In West Jerusalem is Menachem Klein, Professor of Political Science at Bar-Ilan University. He is also the author of Lives in Common, Arabs and Jews in Jerusalem, Jaffa and Hebron. In Colchester is Natasha Lindstaedt, US policy and foreign policy specialist. She is the Deputy Dean in the Department of Government at the University of Essex. And in Alexandria, Virginia is Yusuf Munir, head of the Palestine-Israel Programme and Senior Fellow at the Arab Centre. A warm welcome to all of you. Thank you for joining us here on Inside Story. Menachem, if I could begin with you, first of all, we heard that it's costing Israel $246 million a day. How big is the financial burden on Israel as it carries out this war?
The Israeli war operation cost a lot. I'm not an expert on security financial issues, but the imagine that the whole economy is stopped. Tens of thousands of productive people are recruited and deployed along the borders. So the whole economy is in hold, and the Israeli shekel is losing vis-a-vis the American dollar. So it's a huge burden on Israeli economy. What was maybe cannot be repaired or come back within a short period.
Natasha, we've heard economists warn, saying that the cost to Israel will be unlike anything it has experienced in decades. Do you think that the people there and the government is prepared to pay for this war in the long term?
Are you speaking of the government of Israel?
Yes.
I think based on what Netanyahu has said, that they are incredibly determined and that there's no turning back. From what I've heard, it's been described as their own 9/11. If you were to compare, the U.S. spent $2 trillion in the war on terror in response to 9/11. So when there's been a trauma, often governments get behind sometimes incredibly expensive war efforts to address the trauma that the public may feel, whether that is wrong or right. But that seems to be what has happened in the past. And of course, this has incredibly detrimental effects on civilian death toll and escalation. But I can imagine the resolve is quite strong.
Yusuf, we've seen the humanitarian toll that the people in Gaza have had to bear over the last several weeks. But what about Hamas in particular? I mean, where does it get its money from and its arms? And presumably those are now getting reinforcements into the Strip. Obviously is not going to happen because of the blockade and the closure of the borders completely. What happens from Hamas's perspective about having to continually defend itself against Israel from here?
Well, I think the short answer is we simply don't know. We don't know where this is going. We don't know how it's going to end. We don't know what Gaza will look like if there is a Gaza at the end of the Israeli campaign there. If you listen to some of the statements from Israeli officials talking about annihilation, talking about making Gaza a place that is unlivable, it's hard to really imagine what this place will look like when they are done. We've seen massive bombardment with a huge percentage of the structures in Gaza being decimated. Of course, this leads to large-scale depopulation as well. And there's no clear sense of when the people who lived in those places will be able to go back to their homes, and if they will be able to go back to their homes. So we're talking about a completely different paradigm than the one that existed prior to October 7th in Gaza, which itself was a humanitarian crisis to begin with, and an extremely desperate situation for most of the people that live there. So it's simply not clear. What we do know is that the costs will be extremely high, and those who are the most vulnerable in society will bear the brunt of it.
Menachem, we know that the US has backed Israel wholeheartedly since the beginning of this war, and it gives roughly $3.8 billion a year. And there is another financial aid package has been proposed by Joe Biden's administration. How dependent is Israel on the US when it comes to this war? Obviously, today we're talking financially. So from a financial point of view.
From a financial point of view, Israel is not only financial point of view, but also security-wise. Israel is fully dependent on the United States, also politically in UN institutions. So Israel cannot, let's say, distance itself too far from the United States. Israel must get now emergency aid to maintain the war, to continue the war, and Israel must continue getting US financial aid and political help, backing actually, the day after. The key question is when the day after starts, when we count the day after, when the war ends. Will it end with a ceasefire? Will it end with Israelis evacuating reoccupied Gaza Strip? Nobody knows. The Israelis, it seems that the Israeli administration has no plan for the day after, nor a definition when the day after starts.
I want to stick with the United States here for a little bit because they are so integral to all of this. Now, the Biden administration put together a $1.5 billion national security package that includes military and humanitarian assistance for conflicts in Ukraine as well as Israel. It said $14.3 billion of that is for Israel. But now that there is a new Speaker of the House, Natasha, that the Republicans are now saying that they will put forward a bill that only focuses on aid for Israel. How complicated is this all getting from a political point of view in getting money to Israel?
I think in terms of getting money to Israel, because the Republicans are so adamant that they do want to support Israel, and you see not just the Republican elites, but Republican support for Israel amongst the public is quite high. And they're going to ensure that the aid, that whatever military aid we're giving, well, whatever Ukraine needs may be up in the air. The aid to Ukraine is probably not going to be up in the air. They're going to try to push that through. And you're seeing that there is some convergence here with Biden, who has been a fairly pro-Israeli president, asking for $14 billion, as you mentioned. And the pressure really will be more on what happens in the war in Ukraine. As Israel starts to need more precision-guided munitions, artillery rounds, and shells, this will going to come at the same time that Ukraine might be needing more sophisticated weapons as well. And whether or not the U.S. can produce both of these for both countries at the same time is unknown. But I think what we're seeing here with the political climate in the U.S., with the Republicans in control of the House and a more right-wing speaker, Mike Johnson, than even in the past, if that's possible. Israel would be the priority over aid to Ukraine.
Yusuf, you're obviously in the United States, and we have seen shows of solidarity, rallies there for Palestinians, despite the United States' support of Israel. What is the sense there in terms of long-term financially backing Israel here?
I think one of the important lessons from what we're seeing here in the United States in terms of the dwindling support for financing the Ukraine war is that Americans have become quite tired of supporting endless military engagements that they don't quite understand why they are taking place or why they are so important. And now, well over a year into a war in Ukraine, more and more Americans are saying, why are we doing this? Why are we spending money on this? And I think, while there is, of course, tremendous political support for Israel here in the United States, this is a message that, Americans themselves are not going to want to engage their tax dollars in an open-ended way, especially when there is no clear objective, no clear end game in sight when it comes to what Israel is doing in Gaza. And I would say that, we spoke a little bit earlier about some of the costs here and Israel's reliance on the United States. The Israelis fought a war in 1967 against multiple state armies. And at that time, of course, they relied on Western arms, but they didn't rely on direct American intervention. And today we see Israel, needing effectively 2, if not more, American aircraft carriers to stave off 2 non-state actors. And so I think Israel has become more dependent on the United States today than it's ever been. And the costs of this are not just going to be economic. They're going to be political costs and policy costs as well that I think are going to reshape the way Israeli policymakers thought about much of their security situation and their economic and political relations as well.
Natasha, just briefly, there's obviously going to be an election in the United States next year. How big a part is financial package to Israel going to play a part in that election, do you think?
I'm not sure it's going to play a huge part because we see other issues becoming more important, whether it be the fight for democracy, if it's a Biden-Trump contest, or issues related to inflation or issues related to the border. Americans have typically not prioritized foreign policy issues in voting as much as some of these other domestic issues. But we'll have to see how things unfold. I mean, at the moment, though, much of the international community is asking for a ceasefire and very concerned about the plight of innocent Palestinian civilians. The polling data that we're seeing in the U.S. is showing that Biden is in step with much of the public. You have even 72% of Democrats saying that they feel protecting Israel is an important aspect of American foreign policy, and 80% of Republicans. And only 18% of Americans thought that the Israeli response has been too harsh. So I think it's possible if the war goes on and becomes very expensive, it could be a drain, there could be some fatigue. But as long as U.S. troops aren't directly involved, I don't see this being a huge issue in the 2024 election because it will be overshadowed by other domestic issues.
Of course. Okay, thank you. I want to get back
Can I add to that point?
Yeah, of course, Yusuf.
Yeah, because I do think there are complications here, especially when you look at sort of the demographic breakdowns and some of the polling on this issue. There are some key demographics that the Biden campaign needs to have strong turnout in, particularly younger Americans who see this situation very differently than their older counterparts. And I think that this is going to be a real challenge for a Biden reelection campaign. And add to that, of course, an Arab and Muslim community here in the United States, which is outraged over the Biden administration's approach to this so far. And when you consider how narrow elections are here in the United States and how key constituencies can make massive differences in very specific states, it becomes a significant problem for a election campaign that relies on a large and diverse coalition like the Democrats tend to do, and rely on significant youth turnout as well. So while the overall public opinion polling is supportive, when one reads between the lines, there are significant alarm bells, political alarm bells, that should be going off in Biden campaign headquarters.
Yeah. I want to get back to the sense inside Israel now. Menachem, is there a discussion going on in Israel at this point in time, a concern over how it will be able to pay for this war? We've seen the finance minister come out and say that this year's budget is no longer relevant. The S&P Global Ratings Agency has downgraded the economic outlook from stable to negative. Is there any discussion about this at all?
Only limited discussion. There is a growing awareness of the compensation of the huge amount of money needed to reconstruct the destroyed kibbutzim and towns adjacent to Gaza Strip. They are destroyed. And add to that the evacuation of those places, tens of thousands of people, not only near Gaza Strip, but also in the north along the Israeli-Lebanon border. So the people living in distance of up to 5 kilometers in the north were asked by the government to evacuate and go to hotels that the government funds for them temporarily, of course. So much depends how long the war continues, whether the war expands also to the north. A second front opens between Israel and Lebanon. Add to that that this functioning Israeli government, the Israeli government performance are very, very poor due to different causes and reasons. But the performance are very, very poor. Only in the last few days, the Israeli cabinet appointed a coordinator for rebuilding the south, the kibbutzim and towns in South Israel. So it will take much time, and the Israelis will learn while walking. And I don't know how it will end up.
No. Natasha, we heard a little bit there about a potential second front opening. What would be the consequences if Israel is forced to fight Hezbollah in the north as well as Hamas in the south?
Well, I think it would be catastrophic. Of course, it would be incredibly difficult for the Israelis to have to do this, but I just worry about the war becoming even more internationalized. Wars that become more internationalized, of course, have much higher civilian death toll, and they go on for much longer. I mean, this would be the last thing that we would need, of course, at a moment when we're trying to get a ceasefire to attend to the civilian casualties and humanitarian crisis facing Gaza, where they're struggling to get food, water, and electricity, and just basic needs met. And if we then get into a second front, this will put a strain on any kind of effort to do this. But then we also see that when international actors get involved, the death toll just rises, as I mentioned.
Yeah. Yusuf, there's obviously the occupied West Bank, which is another issue here. Obviously, people in Gaza are living a nightmare at this point in time, and there's the financial impact that this war is going to have inside Israel. But what about for those Palestinians trying to earn a living in the occupied West Bank? How difficult is that now, and will it continue to be in the future?
Yes, well, there are parts of the West Bank, including in Area C, where some Palestinians live, where the economic situation has, for many years, been more desperate than the economic situation in Gaza, which is something we don't often hear about and can't really wrap our heads around. But of course, the military occupation in the West Bank is debilitating for its economic prospects and really deprives billions of dollars worth of economic growth from the Palestinian economy in the West Bank. Since October 7th, things in the West Bank have become much, much worse. Israeli settlers who received additional arms from their supporters in the Israeli government have carried out numerous attacks against Palestinians in the West Bank. This is something that has been escalating in recent months and years prior to October 7th. And there is elevated violence against Palestinians now in the West Bank, with over 100 Palestinians that have been killed by either soldiers or settlers since October 7th. This comes at a time where violence against Palestinians in the West Bank was at its highest point since international organizations like the United Nations have been keeping track of the statistics there on these things. So the situation is extremely volatile. And, we talk about the possibility of a northern front. There's, of course, the real possibility that there is massive destabilization in the West Bank as well. And we see a spread of this across the entirety of the map, not just outside of Israel and Palestine, but inside of it as well.
Natasha, I'm sure that you've seen some of the huge protests, the rallies of solidarity for Palestinians that have been taking place right around the world. I mean, for example, in London, we saw hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people take to the streets. One of the main things that they are calling for is the UK to stop funding, stop supporting Israel. How much pressure is coming on these Western governments to pull its support of Israel, and what consequences will that have, do you think?
Well, there's certainly protests going around the world, not just London, but also in the U.S. as well, from people upset about the government's support of Israel and wanting to take a tougher stand, or at least in trying to pressure Israel to respond with more restraint in Gaza and to get some sort of ceasefire and to attend to the needs of innocent civilians. But whether or not that actually results in a policy change, we've seen there have been many protests over conflicts over time. If you look at the big picture, it often only just to small changes. Of course, there's counterexamples where something actually works, where the protest movement is able to influence government. But if we were to look at all of these different episodes of protest and applying pressure on governments, governments ultimately end up doing what they feel they need to do of what is their best interest in these particular moments.
Menachem, we've got a minute or two left. I just want to ask for you to sum up the sense of what it is like there in Israel. Does it feel like everyone there doesn't really care about how much this war is going to cost, that they are willing to pay whatever price it might be as long as Israel wins, whatever winning looks like?
The winning looks like getting rid completely from Hamas. I think that this is unachievable. Israel can get rid of Hamas leaders, but Hamas as an idea or a social welfare institution or employee in Gaza, as an administration that runs the government agencies in Gaza, it will be impossible and to destroy. It will be a big mistake if Israel follows Bush Jr. policy in Iraq. Rooting or creating a chaos in Gaza will backfire Israel. It's counterproductive. Israel must think seriously how to cooperate with Gaza, not how to destroy Gaza Strip. But the Israeli mindset is implementing revenge, very angry and frustrated, without thinking politically on the day after.
Okay, thank you so much for your insight. We really do appreciate all three of you coming on the programme. Menachem Klein, Natasha Lindstaedt, Yusuf Munaya, thank you so much. Well, thank you too for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Tom McRae, and the whole team here, bye for now.